Hey, here are 5 stupid things I've noticed about the Pilgrims. They left Holland because it was too tolerant. In elementary school, I was taught that the Pilgrims came to North America fleeing religious persecution. Turns out that's not exactly true. They did leave England to escape the Church of England, from which they were dissenters, but before coming here, they first settled in Holland. And they left Holland not to escape religious intolerance, but to find a place where they would be better able to impose it on themselves and their children. It seems that the Dutch were a far too open-minded and tolerant people for the Pilgrims, who feared that their liberal neighbors would start to rub off on the kids. So they set off for the New World, where it was tough going at first. But those clever, industrious Pilgrims, they had a few tricks up their sleeves that they hoped would enable them to survive in that strange, harsh, unfamiliar wilderness. And when those didn't work, they stole from the natives. The Pilgrims who established the Plymouth colony and the other English colonists who settled nearby weren't shy about helping themselves to the food stores of local Native American tribes. During one of their first landings, an exploratory party from the Mayflower plundered native graves, removing maize that had been buried there alongside the dead. Later, the colonists' habit of stealing from the local tribes would fuel conflict between the newcomers and the natives, many of whom were probably still a little upset that diseases introduced by earlier European explorers had decimated their populations. Oh, which reminds me of another thing about the Pilgrims. They hastened the annihilation of native tribes. I think we can all agree that the European conquest of the New World wasn't such a good thing for the folks already living here. And even though they may not have been the very worst perpetrators of violence and persecution against Native American tribes, the Pilgrims' hands are certainly not clean in this regard. In addition to stealing provisions and spreading disease, they would occasionally join their fellow nearby English settlers in committing acts of straight-up mass murder against local tribes. Back in those early days, the military leader of the Plymouth colony was a dude named Myles Standish, and you might have heard of him. Well, let me tell you something about Myles Standish. Myles Standish was a dick. I'll give Standish this much: he seems to have been a tough son of a bitch, but he was also a violent hothead who suffered from a severe case of Napoleon syndrome, or whatever they called it back then. I realize that Napoleon syndrome isn't an actual psychological condition, and I would never describe anyone by referring to such a derogatory concept, even an asshole like Standish, if it weren't for the fact that when the Massachusetts chief Pexuo insulted Standish's stature, he responded by coming back the next day and stabbing him to death with Pexuo's own knife. Standish then ordered his men to kill 4 more Massachusetts warriors, one of whom they decapitated, and Standish took the decapitated head back to Plymouth with him. So, yeah, I think Longfellow let him off a little easy. The black hats and buckles look is all wrong. I know it's a superficial note to end on, but for me, one of the most disillusioning truths about the Pilgrims is that they didn't actually dress strictly in black and white clothes with buckles on their hats and their shoes, contrary to their depictions in my childhood Pilgrim coloring books. Yeah, I had Pilgrim coloring books when I was a kid. You got a fucking problem? The truth is, the Pilgrims actually wore many different colors. Their shoes had laces, and the buckle look didn't come into fashion in Europe until decades after the Pilgrims had landed in North America. And that depiction of the Pilgrims dressed in that costume dates to much, much later than that. In fact, to the 19th century, by which time the buckle look had fallen out of style and had come to symbolize the quaintness and simplicity of days gone by. In other words, Victorian illustrators dressed the Pilgrims that way to make them look like rubes. Serves them right. The hardest part is only picking 5. Catch you next time.